Okay, so I'm delighted to welcome tonight's speaker. So Dr. Jonathan Conlin is a historian of the British cultural history from the 1970s all the way up to the present, which sounds a bit more like current affairs to me, and certainly very interesting. So John studied history and modern languages at the University of Oxford before going on to complete a master's in history of art at the Courtauld Institute. He then went on to do a doctorate looking at the history of the National Gallery at the University of Cambridge, which I have to say sounds so interesting. I might go and see if I can download it from Ethos after this talk. And he's now a senior lecturer at the University of Southampton. For 2019, he organised the Charles Kingsley 200 Festival Pageant, which was celebrating 200 years since the birth of the author and social reformer, which means he is excellently placed to speak to us on his topic tonight, which is called Rinse and Repeat, Christian Evolution and Kingsley's The Water Babies. So John, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Caitlin. I will share my screen. I'll just do that. And then... Okay, can everybody see that?
Yep, I think that's coming through fine.
Excellent. Well, I'm delighted to be here speaking on Kingsley's behalf. I gather this is a series in which you're addressing a number of Victorian greats with whom Sir Walter Morrison had some sort of relationship, at very least of host. It sounds like he was a very accommodating host who was proud to welcome many of the greatest men and perhaps women as well, I don't know, of his time to visit. I'm going to focus on the Reverend Charles Kingsley, and particularly his best known work, which we probably categorize today as a children's work, but which he, in keeping with many of his other books, arguably aimed at a far broader audience than that, seeking to question a lot of the traditional genres as well as the different ways in which we like to slice and dice up audiences. I myself became interested in him not so much from childhood reading. I don't think I read The Water Babies, Westward Ho, Hypatia, Hereward the Wake, or any of his other largely historical romps. But I did come across him when I was doing my PhD at Cambridge and read that he had been Regius Professor of History at Cambridge, to a post to which he was appointed in 1859. And I remember at the time thinking how strange it was that this man who seemed so unqualified to hold such an eminent historical post had come to hold that position. And it becomes even stranger when you read his lectures, which have been published as well, some of which read almost as writing for children. Indeed, he was someone I think you liked to read fairy tales to adults and serious scientific tomes to children as a way of mixing up the expectations of his public. What interests me about him was, therefore, having discovered that he'd been appointed to the historical position, was to go back to his historical fiction and look at how he understood the history of England, which he definitely saw as England rather than Britain. And I had for a few years, a research project looking at how his model of Englishness applied certainly highly racialized views of English identity, which he nonetheless saw as highly scientific. He was someone, as we'll see, who was in touch with the leading scientific minds of his day. And in terms of why that was interesting, not only was his historical side to his identity, his rather multifaceted persona, less explored than the more familiar sides of the social reformer, the Chartist, the sanitary reformer, and the imperialist. But I was also interested in how the new evolutionary science of Darwin was being applied to not so much natural history, but to national history. So that is where my own interest in Kingsley became piqued. And then it happened that a few years later, we were beginning to think about the bicentennial of Charles Kingsley's birth. To get his dates out there, he was born in 1819 and died in 1875. So he did not live to a ripe old age, perhaps because he was overworking himself and constantly working, fishing, as well as thinking and writing very hard. Just to contextualize that with your local man, Walter Morrison was born in 1836. So there was about a 16, 17-year gap between them, although they both were educated at Oxbridge and were otherwise, in class terms, slightly similar backgrounds. Kingsley came from what at the time would have been called decayed gentlefolk, family that had fallen, originally been noble, but which had fallen on hard times. His father was an Anglican priest, and therefore he, at Oxford, decided to go to, at Cambridge, he went to Magdalen College, Cambridge, decided almost faute de mieux to become an Anglican priest in succession to his father. This was in the 1840s, a time which, in contrast to the equipoise of the 1850s and the rather smug self-confidence that came in the wake of the Great Exhibition of 1851, the 1840s were, if you were a young undergraduate, a time of great intellectual and personal ferment, which, among other things, gave us John Newman's 1845 conversion from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism, which really rocked the otherwise genteel world of Oxbridge and the Anglican Church as well. He was someone who very much felt it was important to be in touch with nature. He was the originator of a form of hard walking, perhaps also hard drinking Christianity, which emphasized muscular exertion and a certain amount of fighting as a means of expressing a Christian manliness. This, in his own age, was pejoratively referred to as muscular Christianity, but as with so many labels intended to be insulting, impressionism would be another one, this was rapidly adopted as and used semi-seriously without being seen as an insult by Kingsley and his fellows. If he's associated with any part of England today, however, it's probably either Eversley in Hampshire, where he was rector for 26 years and where he died in 1875, or also with Devon, where he partly grew up. His family came from down there, and thanks to the success of Westward Ho, set in Bideford, there is now a town called Westward Ho, the only place in Britain that has an exclamation mark after it. And in a sense, a remarkable case of a city being named after a novel. I can't think of any other examples in Britain, but it shows just how phenomenally successful Kingsley's works were, particularly in the decades after his death, not only in Britain, but in the Anglosphere, in Australia, New Zealand, and particularly America, certainly well into the interwar period, but then obviously going off into a steep decline, certainly in the 1960s, and profoundly unfashionable today. I was trying to find connections to Yorkshire other than having visited Walter Morrison, and it appears that staying with Morrison did give him the idea of writing a historical novel based on the Pilgrimage of Grace. However, he did not complete that novel, and I'm not even sure notes for it survive. But otherwise, he wrote novels set in the Fens, set in Devon. He was a canon of Chester Cathedral, and wrote novels, even some novels partly set in Ireland. But sadly, not, other than Morrison, not many connections to your neck of the woods. In many ways, he's been seen as a typical Victorian, and yet the closer you look at him, the harder it becomes to see him as quintessentially Victorian, insofar as he seems to encapsulate in one man roles and personas that otherwise seem to be in direct conflict with each other. Hypatia, which was his novel set in 4th century Alexandria, was Queen Victoria's favorite novel. And yet at the same time, in the 1840s, as a young man, he had been very open about his support for the Chartist movement. This was a movement of the working class to secure the Charter, a list of civil liberties, including the vote, many of which they didn't get until the early 20th century. To call oneself, certainly as an Anglican priest of a good family, a Chartist in the 1840s would be rather like calling oneself a communist in 1950s America. It would have been really, I think he knew what he was doing in calling himself a Chartist and a strong sympathizer, but it led, among others, to the Bishop of London forbidding him from preaching inside his diocese. So it was quite a risky strategy, but it brought him in the 1840s into contact with other figures who would later on become identified with Christian socialism. Thomas Hughes, the fellow author of Tom Brown's School Days, J.M. Ludlow, and other founders of the cooperative movement, which I know Sir Walter Morrison was very keen in supporting. So the sense in which he was both intensely loyal to the Queen, but also someone willing to dabble in quite violent, sometimes violent forms of radicalism. We often associate Victorian vicars with prudery, and yet his stance on opposing celibacy for Christians, which brought him into stark and very in print a feud with John Henry Newman, who became Cardinal Newman, a quarrel in print which directly inspired Newman to publish his Apologia Pro Vita Sua in 1875, in the 1870s. So Kingsley was, in a sense, been seen as the fly in the amber. It's commonly held that he lost that particular dispute with Newman. We tried to argue the other way in our various bicentenary events. The reason he was opposed to celibacy was because he viewed the pleasure to be had in sexual congress as given by God as a quasi-sacrament to be enjoyed within companionate marriage. Shortly prior to his marriage to Frances Grenfell, who came from a rather wealthier semi-industrial family, he produced a remarkable series of drawings, a kind of almost like an illuminated manuscript of thoughts, of his own thoughts on the sacraments and on what sex meant to him, illustrated with scenes such as this on the left, which he drew himself, which shows him and his wife Frances engaged in the sexual act while flying up to heaven. There were many other scenes in this in which he depicted them whipping each other and engaging in other acts. And there's another scene in which they are again having sex while lashed to a cross floating on the sea. So there's a strong sense here about linking traditional sacraments like baptism or communion with having sex. Again, something which seems to sit rather oddly with our vision of a Victorian cleric. These drawings were kept in the sort of black hole of the British Library until I think I was the first person about 10 years ago to challenge the librarians and suggest that these were actually not so pornographic that one needed to have, as it were, special permission to see them. Although until 2003, I think you did require special permission to view them because they were viewed as so shocking and so pornographic. So it was far from Victorian in the sense that we often use that adjective pejoratively. As a clergyman, certainly many of my students assume to this day that you can't be a Christian and an evolutionist at the same time, as this carte de visite, which is a very small, it's trying to look like a photograph, but it clearly isn't. I don't think this gathering ever happened, and if it did, it wasn't photographed. But here you can see on this collection of Victorian worthies from the 1870s, we see another fellow friend of Morrison, J.S. Mill, on the left, immediately shoulder to shoulder with Kingsley, and of course directly opposite Kingsley is Darwin, who I understood also visited Morrison. So he was a clergyman among scientists who did not feel that there was any sense in which he was being scandalous by associating himself with the author of The Origin of Species, the book that was published in 1859. So a revolutionary among at court, a clergyman among scientists, a celebrator of sex in the pulpit, many different sides of him that seem not to go very well together. And it's important to recognize that not only did he endeavor to be friendly with men like Darwin, they valued his friendship. And there are many very surprisingly intimate letters between him and Darwin's bulldog, the fellow paleontologist Thomas Henry Huxley, of whom more later. Indeed, in the second edition of The Origin of Species, Darwin quotes Kingsley, not actually naming him, but describing how a divine had written him a letter after having read the first edition to say it was no less a mighty vision of the creator to imagine the creator creating the world by indirect means, in other words, through natural selection, rather than in a flash in the 7-day account of Genesis. He asked Kingsley's permission if Kingsley was willing to be quoted, if indirectly, in the second edition. Kingsley was only too delighted. So in a sense, Kingsley has been, and still is, in a sense, lurking within the pages of what we might see as a revolutionary, perhaps atheistical text. One of the key things and the key lessons I think he has to teach us today is that what we might see in the age of, with Dawkins still around, as polar opposites, forcing us to choose between faith and science. Kingsley was very aware, as I think all philosophers of science are, that science exists within a structure of belief and is not therefore totally alien or foreign to faith as we understand Christianity or Islam. This is the letter which he wrote to Darwin after reading The Origin of Species. And this was a letter that Darwin quotes in the second edition and in all subsequent editions. As it says here, Kingsley didn't see this was a flash that had come to him. He had gradually learned that it is just as noble a conception of the God to believe that he created primal forms that then self-developed. In other words, God didn't create all species as they were. He created a few species with a few forms which evolved into many other forms. So Kingsley was someone who was open to the latest science and very much felt that it contributed to a deeper understanding of man's relationship to God, to the science of natural theology, as it was called. Natural theology, the branch of theology which tries to understand God and his plan for the universe by studying the created world. If I look at the created world and I see that it is beautiful and has certain rational, pleasing structure about it, I can thereby, if I'm a natural theologian, extrapolate that the creator must also be loving and a wise systematist. So in 1863, it's first serialized. Kingsley publishes the Origin of Species, The Water Babies, his best known book. Some of you in the audience might have read it. I have to inject a certain note of caution here in that there are very many editions of it which silently bowdlerize the text. It's quite striking to therefore, I think, to try to read the original text as he intended it. It has many passages that subsequent editors and publishers have seen as somehow too difficult for children to understand. There's a long satire in it, for example, about rote learning as then practiced in the educational system of Victorian Britain. There's also a lot of satires of Huxley and the love of obscure language and terminology that he, I think, rightfully accuses men of science of practicing. So if this lecture inspires you to try and get a read of the original Water Babies text as he wrote it, that would be a victory for me as far as I'm concerned. This process of bowdlerization is sometimes overt, insofar as if I did a quick survey of the 98 or 99 editions, I think, of Water Babies that appear in the 20th century, and some of them in the title as shown here are very open that they are retold for little readers. And my favorite title of all was Water Babies Retold Chiefly in Words of One Syllable for Young Children. Many of these bowdlerizations and Gerberizations, I think, slightly underestimate the ability of children to understand, even if they aren't familiar with the terminology, to understand the arguments that Kingsley is making, to an extent that we, in a perhaps slightly patronizing way as adults, assume that they do not understand. I think there has been a sort of retroactive act of patronizing children that Kingsley would himself, an attitude he himself would not have shared. So to turn to the man I'm sure you're more interested in, Sir Walter Morrison, here is a photo which I think Caitlin or Heather might have sent me, which is him apparently lecturing locals on perhaps proprietary to a walk on or retelling the story of the Water Babies. which was partly inspired, at least in setting, by Kingsley staying as Morrison's guest in 1858, I believe. Yes, 1858. I looked into the notes I have of Kingsley's correspondence. I've been to try and track down his letters, and sadly, I wasn't able to find. I don't think I'd ever read a letter between them. Maybe they survive in another archive, which I'm not aware of. Among the many inspirations in the local landscape, however, Morrison's house itself plays a major role in the Water Babies as the model for Hartover House, which is where Ellie, the heroine, as it were, of the Water Babies, who is presented as white and clean in contrast to the dirty chimney sweep Tom, and is very much the woman he wants to be, or the young girl he wants to evolve to be worthy of. She is the daughter of Hartover House, and Tom the Sweep is sent there with Grimes, his rather casually cruel master, to sweep the chimneys. As described in The Water Babies, the higgledy-piggledy house is celebrated for the very sense in which, like an evolved organism, each generation of the squires inhabiting it has, rather than tearing down and started again, in the sense of the Genesis God, perhaps destroying the whole of creation in a deluge for sinfulness and then starting again. Instead, this house has evolved. There has been a series of slow additions, accretions growing on it in the same way that evolution happens. And the analogy continues when Tom disappears up the chimney to clean it. He quickly finds that he gets lost in what turns out to be a branching network of chimneys, which surprises him, and he ends up falling down a different chimney, trying to find his way out, and lands in the grate of little Ellie's room, which is a key turning point in the novel because she's asleep. He observes her in her white dress, white-skinned, clean skin in her white room, and he then looks at himself in her mirror and for the first time recognizes that he is dirty. Kingsley's point, in a sense, I suppose, is about sinfulness. Up until this point, he's been, as it were, innocent of his own sin, unaware of his own sin. Now that he's seen that cleanliness is possible, and Ellie is clean and white, he is convicted of sin and therefore seeks the journey of trying to cleanse himself begins. But if you think about the analogy of the chimney, he starts out, in a sense, with the Genesis model of creation as a chain of being, where man is at the top and simple animals and plants are at the bottom. That's the sort of straight up and down ladder, could be seen as a chimney. Instead, Tom the Sweep discovers or encounters, instead of where he's expecting a clear ladder, a chain of being, perhaps a straight chimney going up, he finds that actually this system is one involving forks in the road. In a sense, what he's done, if we think about the forking chimneys as an evolutionary tree, is he's traveled up to the point in the evolutionary tree where his line and the line of Ellie meet, and has fallen down, as it were, the alternative path, the path, as it were, his ancestors did not take, and therefore ended up in the other, encountering a very different species, which is Ellie. It's the conviction of sin and seeing that he's covered in black, which leads him to suddenly run out of the house, pursued by the whole staff. And he ends up running, it's described as being like a gorilla running back to the forest, running up to the hill, and at a certain point slides down Goredale Scar. And apparently Kingsley suggests that the black scar there is the mark left behind as the sweep falls down it or walks his way down it. He then ends up in a stream where he repeats to himself, I must be clean, I must be clean. And in the water cleanses himself, drowns, and turns into a form of newt. And then we're off to the races. He then enters this magical underwater world in which he quickly learns the rules of the game. If he acts in a good way, his scales and his gills disappear and he becomes something higher up the evolutionary chain. If, however, he is wicked, he regrows spines and becomes a slightly less desirable form of being. Part of his mission that he's told, if he wants to be worthy of the white Ellie, is that he has to go on a journey. and he eventually meets the Mother Nature figure, Mother Carey, beyond the edge of the world, as it were, and is surprised to find that she is inactive, apparently inactive. She's not busy making things. He's been told or heard, he says, that Mother Nature was always making new beasts out of old. And Mother Nature, or Mother Carey here, replies, that's what people think, but why would I bother doing that when I can make creatures make themselves? Tom says, wow, yes, I can see how that's a clever way of doing things. And the Kingsley, as the narrator, intervenes to say, and he was quite right. So the story of the water babies is a fantasy, but with a lot of serious science behind it. It's also got a lot of satires about it, some of which perhaps have not dated as well as others. I've mentioned the satire of his contemporary scientists for writing in an obscure way. One of his major targets is indeed his friend. I think he's intending it in a joshing spirit, but he has a character whose name consists of the phrase "put them all in spirits" with all the vowels taken out. So put them all in spirits, like that, which is his way of satirizing T.H. Huxley, known as I've said, Darwin's bulldog, as the very public, aggressive, controversial face championing the new theory of evolution by natural selection, in contrast to Darwin's very notoriously retiring and slightly queasy nature when it came to confronting the public and presenting his views to wider audiences. So the theory that Kingsley's presenting in The Water Babies, which he believed, which he himself took entirely seriously as a scientific theory, and wrote the same terms, not just to children in The Water Babies, but to Ralston, to Huxley, and other leading scientists of his day, Ray Lankester, Richard Owen, many other people. He certainly didn't see this as an analogy. This is, as it were, an analogy that maps directly onto how he thinks the universe works. His view is that rather than the soul being something that is temporarily housed in our bodies and which is released again from, as it were, a body condemned to death by its very fleshiness, in the kind of St. Paul attitude to the body as subject to another law, rather he sees the body as made in God's image, and that the body and the soul remain together and continue to evolve after death. This obviously has the advantage that in heaven we can continue to have we can continue to find a form of sexual congress. Kingsley was very concerned at the idea that men and women might not be given in marriage in heaven as on earth, something which Jesus himself says, but which Kingsley had real problems with. He wanted to continue to enjoy communion of a sexual kind with his wife Fanny after death. So Kingsley's view was that the soul secretes, in a sense, the body in the same way that a snail makes his shell. So in a sense, if we are virtuous, we die, and through a process of kind of metempsychosis, we're reincarnated in a higher form of being, a spiritual being perhaps. Whereas if we are evil, we are punished not by fire and brimstone and eternal gnashing of teeth, but by being relegated to the sort of B leagues of evolution, in the same way that Tom is given spines and an unpleasant, hard exterior when he doesn't quite behave in the right way. So Kingsley's theory is, this is where I got my idea of rinse and repeat. Kingsley's vision of life and the afterlife, and indeed of the evolution of the universe, is one of cycles in which judgment and the second coming, as it were, is eternally deferred. This meant, among other things, that Kingsley refused to believe that there was a hell. He said in one of his letters, I forget to whom, that he felt that God was too good a schoolmaster to ever lose any of his pupils forever, by which he meant lose them to hellfire and damnation. This was a belief that he knew to keep, that was very controversial in Christian doctrine terms at the time, but he very much felt that the idea of hell had entered Christian doctrine through the Roman idea of Tartarus. So this was a sense, an accretion that had been attached, a false growth, as it were, that had been stuck on an otherwise pure Christian doctrine. So in the same spirit of muscular Christianity, constantly deferring judgment and constantly having these cycles of activity feels very Victorian, in the sense that there's a lot of effort and work and a kind of running in place that is going on constantly. So Kingsley is a man who very much saw the scientific world as one in which constant effort was necessary, both to live one's life and to understand life itself. This is perhaps one reason why throughout his career he had a series of breakdowns through overwork or mental overexertion, and as I said, did not live to a terribly ripe old age. What I think his message about science that I think is particularly valuable to us today is to recognize that there is bigotry in both Christianity and, we might say, faith in general, as well as in science, what we might call scientism in church, in science. This is a sense of attributing a absolute truth and a high level of precision and authority to data, to beliefs, to knowledge, which is not able to bear that degree of authority without, as it were, collapsing under its own weight. As he wrote to T.H. Huxley, this is a letter, one of remarkable letters which Kingsley wrote to Huxley, which they exchanged rather, at a time of great personal crisis for Huxley. Huxley's son Noel had died as a small infant of one of the many diseases to which children were prone then, I think puerperal fever, died very young, as in had been perfectly well and within 48 hours was dead. Huxley really struggled to deal with this, and interestingly turned and confided in Kingsley at this moment of crisis, rather than, say, to Darwin when it came to searching for comfort. And this began a conversation, rather an exchange of letters not about faith, but also about science. And what Kingsley is saying in this letter, which I think is very important, I think for all of us, I think not just for his own times, but is what he refers to the bigotry of science and a narrowness of science as dangerous as old bigotries. He cites the American professor and Darwinist Asa Gray, who again, a scientist he was writing to, who had written to Kingsley to say that the key to the universe was quantitative analysis, and that if we could only find the ratios of something that probably seems to us unquantifiable, man's self-esteem and man's benevolence, or indeed his combativeness, we could, as it were, pinpoint via very hard data, very hard metrics, exactly how morality and human society worked or failed to work. As Kingsley goes on to say, this exclusive assumption of the value of one method as against all others is the danger which I fear. So what I think he was concerned about was that, in the same way that, say, Christians in an earlier period had, say, scholastics, perhaps going back to the Middle Ages, had felt that there was one school of science, one set of scientific tools, one branch of human knowledge which held the key to all of them. He was equally concerned that people might see the science of evolution, as indeed Huxley did, as the key to unlocking all branches of knowledge. Huxley, late in life, applies the theory of evolution to the Genesis account and the Old Testament itself, describing how, by using this evolutionary analogy, how all human societies evolve from, say, polytheism and animistic beliefs towards an ever narrowing Olympus of gods, until eventually they pass through monotheism to atheism, which he sees, as it were, as the euthanasia of man's mythopoetic development. So that, of course, if you're a Christian, that's a very that seems to be a case of a man of science getting well outside his bailiwick. And yet to Huxley and to many evolutionists, evolution and the theory of transmutation and adaptation was the key to all branches of knowledge, including ethnography and anthropology, as well as paleontology and other branches of science. So Kingsley was willing to go along with men of science, was very excited by the discoveries, but was very cautious of accepting attributing to their theories that degree of authority and truthfulness, truthiness, as we might say, as they themselves claimed. And I think, if anything, the developments since then have suggested that in the same way that Christian theologians have been successively taken captive by the metaphors they have used in their effort to make God's ways known to man. In the same way, I think we've seen in the recent development of evolutionary science that the metaphors, say, of DNA as the code that somehow unlocks and explains all of human life and human illness. When it was believed that code metaphor led many people to assume that we had only to find the gene for this or that ailment in order to prevent it happening. What we've since realized is that there's another layer of RNA laid on top of the DNA, on top of the code, which, as it were, prevents certain of that code from being, certain of those instructions from being expressed, from being carried out, and while certain other instructions embedded in the code are carried out. So we found, I think, scientists gradually come to recognize that code of life metaphor, which they probably adopted in order to make their findings better understood to lay people, has actually ironically had the effect of stymieing and limiting the further development of our understanding of the natural world. And I think, had he been around today to see it and see the reemergence of, for example, neo-Lamarckian approaches to what's called evolutionary development, or Evo-Devo for short, in which the environment has a far greater role to play than Huxley or any strict Darwinist in the 19th century would have held, I think he probably would be having a slight smile and probably telling us, "I told you so." So I think this might seem a long way from a fairy tale for a land baby, which is the subtitle of The Water Babies. And yet I think it's characteristic of Kingsley's playful, but also highly purposive mingling of high and low, the apparently adult and the apparently childlike, of fantasy and scientific fact, that makes his text so worthy of revisiting. Thank you very much.